All right, the next form of behavior or reinforcement, I should say, that you can engage in is what we call punishment. And punishment needs to be used very sparingly. There obviously is a place for it, but the problem with punishment is it typically ruptures relationships and usually leads to short-term compliance and doesn't encourage long-term commitment. You're going to do what the person asked of you in the interim, but it's not going to really affect your behavior long-term, much like positive reinforcement actually would. So with punishment, what we're trying to do is we're adding an unpleasant consequence. So something that is not essentially desirable, but we're adding this unpleasant consequence as a response to a person's behavior. And so the person engaged in some sort of behavior that we do not like. And as a result of that, we implement some type of unpleasant consequence. Now, the whole point of punishment, which is kind of contrary to positive and negative reinforcement, remember, with those two types of reinforcement, we're trying to increase the frequency of desired behavior. With punishment, what we're trying to do is we're trying to reduce the frequency of an unwanted behavior. And so punishment looks a lot of different ways. Most organizations have a corporate punishment system that is progressive. And what that means is that it increases in terms of severity. So if you do something that the organization doesn't approve of, maybe it's a verbal warning and then gravitates towards a written warning and then increases towards maybe suspension and then ultimately ends with termination if you've engaged in the same undesirable behavior over and over and over. And so it increases in terms of its severity. Punishment is very easy to utilize, obviously. However, you really want to use it as a last resort because when used incorrectly, as I mentioned before, punishment has the ability to sever and hurt relationships, which is very significant, especially if you're trying to build commitment and trying to build long-lasting relationships with employees. This can certainly hurt your ability to do that, and it's very, very difficult to come back from that. So certainly positive reinforcement is much more effective because it specifies, for one, specifically what you should do. With punishment, you're merely telling people what not to do, which we know that there is an infinite number of behaviors that you shouldn't engage in. So for that reason, it isn't necessarily that effective. With positive reinforcement, you're specifically identifying the behavior that you want and that you want repeated. So the employee knows, hey, if I do this, I get this. I'm going to continue to do this. Whereas with punishment, all you know is, well, I shouldn't do this anymore, but you don't know what you should actually do, which is part of the problem, part of the limitation with regards to punishment. There are ways that you can utilize it a little more effectively, but for the most part, it doesn't utilize that well. But punishment needs to exist. We know that for certain individuals, nothing would work beyond punishment. And so obviously for certain behaviors that are very, very extreme, right, in a workplace, you certainly need to be able to punish those behaviors to send a message to the other people in the organization, but it shouldn't be utilized very heavily. The last form of reinforcement is what we call extinction. And extinction is very similar to punishment with one regard, but really you're adding no response. To a person's behavior. Extinction shares a similarity with punishment in that its goal is to reduce the frequency of an unwanted behavior. They just do this through a different means, okay? Instead of actually creating or providing an unpleasant consequence like punishment, whether it's a formal write-up, written warning, whatever it is, Extinction, you simply do nothing. And so you don't acknowledge the behavior. Because remember, according to reinforcement theory, behavior is a function of its consequence. So if I don't reward the behavior, meaning I don't acknowledge it, eventually it should just go away on its own. And so an example of this, if you've seen working in an organization and you go through countless meetings, which are obviously very fun, of course, and you always have that person in the meeting that likes to actually crack jokes. And there was like one time where one person that was in the meeting maybe laughed. Maybe it wasn't a very significant laugh, but gave them some type of positive reinforcement for them to want to engage in the behavior again, because naturally we want to do things that we're rewarded for. And so this person continues to do it, continues to do it, and continues to do it. And so according to Extinction, what you would do is simply don't acknowledge it. Don't laugh, don't do anything. And then removing that reinforcer will essentially eliminate the behavior at some point in time. And so that's certainly one thing that you can do. It has worked. I've actually used this myself in a similar setting, and it does work. The limitation, I would say, is that you leave the person to kind of fill in their own blanks. And so this could lead them to conclude a number of different things by you not acknowledging their behavior, whether you're upset with a project they finished, whether you are mad at them personally, whatever the case is, right? I mean, naturally, we kind of gravitate towards the more extreme side, that we did something wrong a lot of the times. So you need to be careful with Extinction. It certainly has its place, but oftentimes because you're not giving the person a great deal of information, you're just not acknowledging their behavior, they can jump to a lot of different conclusions. And so all of these different reinforcers, if you will, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, punishment, and extinction, at least according to Skinner's reinforcement theory, can be utilized to varying degrees as a way of rewarding the behaviors that you want and obviously not rewarding the behaviors that you don't want, either extinguishing them, punishing them, or just not reinforcing them through positive and negative reinforcement and hoping that eventually at some point they would not continue.